For example, tuberculosis kills 1.5 million people every year. Diarrhea kills 1.6 million people every year. And shockingly, nearly 500,000 of those are children who are under 5. And these are easily preventable diseases. And yet we do very little about them, do we? We all love to drive cars. Cars kill 1.35 million people per year in the world. That's shocking, isn't it? The global statistic for probable COVID deaths as I speak is about 346,000, much smaller than any of those other things that we just say as part of our normal life. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but I think it is something we should think about, that the consequences of climate change are going to be very similar to the consequences of this pandemic. They affect everybody in the world. They affect the disadvantaged and the poor and the people in low-income countries far more than they affect those of us in high-income countries. And it's going to be a lot worse than this pandemic. And I think that's something that we certainly should be thinking about as we come to terms with this pandemic. Well, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on the science, just very briefly, because many of you probably know this already, and then I'll go on to some Christian perspectives. So first of all, viruses are not living things in the sense that they can't replicate. They're just little packages of RNA surrounded by a protein, which is why you can wash them off by washing your hands carefully. They require the mechanisms of a host cell that they've invaded in order to reproduce and then spread out from there. And really, the only thing we can do about it really at the moment is to keep somebody alive long enough that their own immune system can neutralize the virus that's circulating around their body. As of now, that's all we can do. They get a bad press, of course, because there are lots of nasty viruses in humans, but they can be useful. They're being used, for example, to try and attack some of those really horrible bacteria which are getting immune to our medicines at the moment. They're called bacteriophages. In some mammals, they act as, they're living in symbiosis. In fact, probably this one that we're currently suffering from lived quite happily within its original pool, which was probably fruit bats. So they're not entirely, they've been around in the tree of life for billions of years. But let me just talk, bring to your attention some of the other viral infections that have been around. Spanish flu, which you may not realize this either, but it followed the First World War and it killed something between 50 and maybe even 100 million people in 2 or 3 waves. We hear more about Ebola and AIDS and SARS and MERS. These are all very similar things which have jumped across from animals to humans. And as you probably know, there's no effective vaccination for AIDS, even now, though we can do things to help people live with it. Let me just pick up one of those, which is smallpox. That's been around in the human population since at least the 3rd century BC, because you find smallpox scars in mummies from Egypt. And it's a wicked disease. It killed 300 million people just in the 20th century. Once you got smallpox, you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. It was a very nasty thing to have. But the good news is that it can be prevented by vaccination. And it was eradicated officially from the world just about 40 years ago in 1980. On May the 8th, almost the same month as we're in now. And that was possible because it was pretty obvious when you had smallpox and people kept away from you. That's going to be much more difficult with COVID because you're infectious maybe before you know you've got it. So that makes it harder to control, even assuming we can make a vaccine, which is not a definite certainty. This is a picture of somebody with smallpox sores all over their body. And it's not something we want to come back into the world. But that is a great triumph, really, of medicine and science, which has brought about the possibility to eradicate it from the human population. Well, what about COVID-19? Almost certainly it jumped from wild animals. We know now that it kills mainly older people and also people with underlying health issues. And it's a very wicked disease in that sense. There's no vaccination at the present. There's no effective drug treatments. The only treatment we have really is to keep people alive long enough by keeping the oxygen level in their blood sufficiently high for them to stay alive until their own body can manufacture some immunity to it. And of course, many people don't manage that. This is data from Spain. I don't want to dwell on it in detail, but it's just to make the point on the right-hand graph, and the ages are down the left-hand side, that it gets much more lethal as you get older. So if you're over 90 years old, you've got a 24% chance of dying, probably, if you get the virus. And almost linearly, the lethality doubles every 6 to 7 years of age. So it was my granddaughter Kessia's 7th birthday on Sunday. Of course, we couldn't go to her birthday party, but she had a Zoom party that she was very excited about. If I catch COVID, I'm about 1,000 times more likely to die than she is. In fact, she has had COVID already because her father, my son, works in the NHS, and he got it fairly badly and he brought it home and his family all had it. I'm glad to say they've all recovered now. But at the beginning of the lockdown, we brought my 90-year-old mother-in-law to live with us here in Cambridge. If she were to catch a COVID virus, I haven't told her this yet, so I don't know if she'll watch this, but if she was to catch it now, she's 16,000 times more likely to die than Kessia would be. So it is very wicked virus for attacking those with old age, those with health problems. And that particular, of course, is the disadvantaged and the poor and some ethnic groups it seems to attack particularly violently. And it's merciful that it seems to spare children. Now, climate change will have just the same effect across the board, although that also, in due course, if it happens, it will affect the poor, the disadvantaged, those in low-income countries, but it will also affect children, I'm afraid. Probably the virus came originally from a pool in fruit bats. 96.2% of the genome in human COVID-19 is identical to that in bats, but it probably came through an intermediate vector animal. We don't know what that is yet. There has been a paper in Nature saying maybe it was a pangolin. Who knows? I don't know why people eat these things, but they do. And one of the places that people worry about is that there is transmission from wild animals to humans. It might happen in wet markets if the hygiene is not good, because you've squashed in lots of wild animals with humans. And generally speaking, our response to the environment, the way we're squeezing wild animals into smaller and smaller places, and then sometimes we're eating those wild animals, makes it much more likely that these viruses, which coexist perfectly happily in wild animals, will jump into humans who have no prior history of them, and so they're very vulnerable to them. And that is one of the big issues, of course. Well, let me just list a few common reactions to pandemics. I don't know if you're in any of these, probably each of us is to some extent. Fear is, of course, a very understandable response. It's a very nasty disease and you can't see it. And people that are transmitting it may not know they've got it. And that's why all we can do is the very medieval thing of just isolating ourselves to keep away. Panic, of course, we've seen panic buying in Britain of food, of even toilet rolls and things when this pandemic was starting up. Corruption, I'm afraid, is part of human life nowadays in this rather broken, dysfunctional world. And there are people around trying to make money out of other people's suffering in the pandemic. My son drives into London and they gave free parking to NHS workers, and I know that NHS workers have been mugged on their way home by people wanting to get hold of the NHS badge so they could get free parking, if you can imagine that. Blame and denial is often a response, isn't it? It's not my fault. Somebody didn't tell me about it. It's somebody else's fault. Some other country's fault, not my fault. And denial. We've seen even leaders of big nations on the world stage just denying that it's a problem. Well, that is a problem if you deny it, because you lose your best chance of doing something about it. And sad to say, there are some Christian groups who deny it because they say if you have enough faith, then you won't suffer from these diseases. And that's just illiterate Bible reading, just complete illiteracy of the Bible. Also very dangerous for people, because you put people in harm's way by that sort of attitude. Grief and lament, which is a very common thing we see in the Bible, of course, through the many disasters. Lament's a quite proper thing, and I think we should all be lamenting the circumstance that we're in now with the pandemic. Lament for why this broken world and so much of the brokenness brought about by human actions allows this sort of thing to happen, because it should not be happening. And then those are all pretty miserable things, aren't they? But also the great altruism and compassion that is being shown by huge numbers of people, all the way from surgeons and doctors and NHS workers, care workers, shop workers, refuse collectors, all those people that we often forget about, that actually now are keeping us all going with huge, often huge compassion, and even down to our streets, you know, where people are looking out for each other. So these are good aspects, I suppose, of the situation in which we find ourselves. Well, that's just a brief summary of the background science. Let me just talk about interaction of theology with this sort of science. And I think absolutely definitely that it's a sign of God's goodness to us that he's made a world that's understandable by science. Understandable in a way that we can get rid of smallpox from this world, that medicine has advanced so that we, at least in high-income countries, we live longer lives, healthier lives, and we can use that understanding of science for the common good in all kinds of ways. And it need not have been that way. And I really do believe that it's because we have a loving creator God who really cares about his creation. He really cares about his creatures, that's us as well as the other creatures in this world, that he's made it the sort of world where we are able to do this sort of thing, to understand the world and make it better for humankind. And this was really built into the origins of the Royal Society, which is really when science got going as an organized grouping of activity in 1660. This was a charter from King Charles II, which still exists. He said the Royal Society's studies are to be applied to furthering promoting, it's very old-fashioned language, I'm afraid, but further promoting by the authority of experiments, the sciences of natural things, that's what we call science, and of useful arts, to the glory of God the Creator and to the advantage of the human race. So it had that twofold purpose, he said, when he set it up. I want to give glory to God because we're studying his creation, and I want this understanding to be used for the advantage of the human race, for the advantage of all humanity, which it has been by and large. Now, one of the things that people sometimes say is that, well, this is just nature. The virus is just nature, and we just have to put up with that. It's not maybe what God would have wanted, but that's nature. But that misses the whole point that Augustine made in the 4th century, that nature is what God does, or another translation, nature is what God is doing. If we believe in a creator God and we believe he's immanent in this world, although he is also transcendent, he also exists outside of it, but if he's acting in this world, and the Bible picture is that he's upholding it, sustaining it moment by moment, then we can't just say, well, that's just nature, that's not God, because nature is what is all around us, and that is what God has done. He's made a world which he said was very good in Genesis 1, and it can be a hazardous world, but he's put us here to live in it, to steward it, to care for, have dominion over it, to look after it in the way he would have looked after it. That's the role he gave to humans right back in Genesis 1. So we can't just say, well, that's just natural because it is the way the world is and it's the way that God meant to make it. Now, interestingly, on the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society's founding, the Royal Society published, or rather the Royal, I suppose the Post Office published, but the Royal Society gave the pictures for it, a dozen first class stamps for the Royal Mail. Of course, they were first class, not second class. And they chose one person from each 35-year period of the Royal Society. Interestingly, half those people were Christians. In fact, most of the founders were Christians, had strong Christian beliefs. That's why they were founding the Royal Society. People like Robert Boyle. And then some of the other people on these stamps, people like Newton, Benjamin Franklin, Babbage, John Lister, were all religious people. That was their motivation. That's not why the Royal Society chose them, of course. They chose them because they had major contributions in that period of 35 years. And one of the people they chose was Edward Jenner from the late 18th century, early 19th century. And it was him that first really got the idea of vaccination going. People, farmers, odd people had been doing it before him. But he lived in a little place called Berkeley in Gloucestershire, which is just down the road from where I grew up as a teenager. And he noticed that milkmaids milking cows often got these sores on their hands from the cows, from cowpox, but then was subsequently immune to smallpox. And he did this, this experiment, which would never ever be allowed nowadays because the ethics committees wouldn't allow it. But he took an 8-year-old, well, he took a 9-year-old Sarah Neems, who was a milkmaid, and she had sores on her hand, took some of the pus from those sores and infected, if you like, or injected them into James Phipps, who was the son of his gardener. In those days, people had lots of staff, so he had a gardener. And then, this was a bit that really wouldn't be allowed now, he then tried infecting James Phipps with smallpox several times, and he didn't get smallpox. And so really, this was when the idea of vaccination really took hold, because smallpox was prevalent and it was really nasty. And he started using this on people in London and elsewhere. And this is a picture from Punch of him doing just that. And it's typical Punch style of the time. You know, there's people growing horse hooves and horse horns and horse heads. There were people that didn't quite like this inoculation technique, actually, just as there are people today that don't like inoculations, and that's why measles and so on has come back. But it worked. Now that was 200 years ago. Before we got rid of smallpox, it took nearly 200 years, as you know. So it took a long time before it became widespread. Now, as I say, we don't know whether this will ever happen, whether we'll ever get a vaccination for COVID, but there is hope, and the people involved in it are pretty hopeful. And there's actually over 100 laboratories working on a vaccine on various different ways of trying to deal with and neutralize the virus at the moment, and there are some hopeful signs. So one of the points that comes out of that I want to make is that science is transnational, and the genome of COVID-19 was shared with the international community within weeks, which I think is a great sign. It might not have happened, so it enabled people to get going on that, and people are accelerating the work on this in a way that only normally happens when you're in a war setting. Things are being done in weeks that normally would take months or even years. So there is hope there for that. That's a bit of the background from the theological side. Let's talk about some specifically Christian perspectives on this. So one of the very obvious things that Christians are called to do is to care for the sick and the dying. And actually, actions speak a lot louder than words do, of course, in this. And there was a famous sermon preached by Bishop Cyprian. Now, he was living in the 3rd century in Carthage. He'd been through a whole load of repression on Christians at the time and hate against Christians. But a major plague ran right through the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. And what Bishop Cyprian said very clearly in this sermon was that Christians ought to stay in Carthage, they ought to stay and help the dying. And indeed, they did just that. They helped many of the people that had been persecuting them previously. And indeed, Christians died disproportionately because of that. But they felt it was their Christian duty, they knew it was their Christian duty to stay and help. Now, in the 16th century, something very similar happened with Luther, when he himself, and he urged many of those around him, Christians around him, to stay in Wittenberg rather than fleeing away from the plague at that time. And interestingly, people saw those actions, and it has been shown historically that often there was revival of Christianity, which often followed these plagues, where Christians had operated so clearly for others at the cost of their own health and sometimes their own life. So it will be interesting in the fullness of time to see how Christians are responding today, won't it, to the same pressures on us with those around us. Just one little example that some of you from Britain may know of this sort of sacrificial care for others was a little town, a little village really, in Eyam in Derbyshire, where the plague came in, and the plague has been wicked across Europe in the Middle Ages and later, killed huge numbers of people. The plague came in on some cloth probably, and there were two pastors in the village, and they got together and decided that they would self-isolate. Just what we're doing today, except they did this in 1665. They completely locked themselves off in the village with the plague in there with them, and no medicine, of course, so that it wouldn't spread to others around them. And indeed, it didn't spread to others around them. But the cost of that, led by the churches, was that out of 800 residents, 300 of them died. And there are plaques as you walk around the village today saying, well, in this cottage here, so many people died and so many of their relatives died. But it's if you get the chance to go to Eyam, it's certainly particularly precious, I think, now in the light of what we're experiencing now, in a way that a few years ago none of us would have imagined, really. Another effect of the coronavirus pandemic is that it does make you reevaluate your main purposes and values in life, doesn't it? What's really important to you, because it's on the line, and what does really matter to you. And C.S. Lewis, I know he's often quoted, but he put it so well that it's worth quoting it again in his book, The Problem of Pain. He wrote that God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And if nothing else, maybe this pandemic is making people think about that sort of issue. What's really important to me, to my family, to my close friends? What is the purpose of life here, since it seems to be so fragile, so easily snatched away? And maybe this is a consequence. I'm not saying this is the reason for the pandemic, but it is a consequence of the pandemic, which might be a good one, a good consequence. And certainly it's made many of us realize the value of community relationships, hasn't it? Being in isolation makes you realize what you're missing. We're now into about the 10th week of that isolation. And interestingly, huge community groups have sprung up. There's a WhatsApp group down my little bit of the road. Hey, I'm going shopping today. What can I get for anybody? Is anybody want a meal today? Can I help with this or that or the other? As well as the general silly videos, which I don't know if you're getting that, but they cheer you up no end when you see a dog walking on its back legs or whatever. Community relationships are really, really crucial, aren't they? And this really makes us realize that. In the rush of life, we often overlook it. It's what Paul said when he wrote to the Philippians. Don't look to your own interests, he said to them, but each of you to the interests of the others. It's an obvious Christian perspective, isn't it? And that's not surprising, because Christianity is a relational religion. Most obviously a relationship with Jesus, with God through Jesus, but also, therefore, because of that, therefore outward to others around us. It is a relational religion, and it's nothing without that. Another consequence of this pandemic is making us think about death. And I think there are conversations about death happening, which is not a bad thing. If we'd lived 100 years ago and more, we would have known all about death. It would have happened in our own homes, those around us, and we would have seen dead people, which in our sanitized, high-income Western lifestyle, we often don't. I was 40, no, older than that, 50 before I saw a dead person, which happened to be my mother. It's not something that we see, and I think that's to our detriment, because death happens to all of us, and Christ said he's defeated death. It is a really fundamental Christian perspective, that death will happen, but death in this world is not the end. And again, to quote Philippians, from that letter there, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. What he meant by that was that while I live in this world, then I can do work that would please Jesus Christ. But if I die, I'll go to be with him in the new creation. And actually, that Bishop Cyprian said much the same in that sermon that I mentioned earlier. He said, this is what he said: if you truly believe in God as a Christian, why do you, who are destined to be with Christ and secure in the promise of the Lord, not rejoice that you're called to Christ and be glad that you're free from the devil? It's maybe not language that we would use, but there's contemporary language which more or less we could use that says the same thing. This is the Christian perspective, and that's why I think so many Christians in Cyprian's time and ever since have been willing to serve others at the cost of their own health and well-being and wealth, very often. Jesus talked about death quite a lot, and there's one interesting case where a tower in Siloam fell down and killed people. Now, this wasn't a pandemic, this particular one. Obviously, it was either shoddy building or an earthquake. 18 people were killed. And people came to him and asked, whose fault is this? Do you hear that? It's the same blame game again, isn't it? Whose fault is it? Were they sinful, or maybe their parents were, or their grandparents? Were they particularly sinful? Is that why they died? And Jesus, as so often, just turned this question around. He said, those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem, where this tower was? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So what he was saying was that the most important thing is not physical death, but your relationship with God. And that's what repentance is. It's turning around to put yourself right with God again. And that's the most important thing. It's not the physical death, it's the death separated from God. And so I think this pandemic certainly brings about the possibility of talking about some of these issues, which are so fundamental to the Christian faith, because it was Jesus's resurrection from the dead that guarantees this new life. And as this same Apostle Paul said, that if Christ is not raised from the dead, then our faith of all is, we're most to be pitied and our faith is useless, he said. But of course, he was raised from the dead, and there's abundant evidence for that. The other thing this pandemic is doing, it is exposing the fractures in this world. It's exposing the corruption of this world, the inequities and injustices of our practices. Maybe it's a global economic system which keeps so many people poor while a few get rich. And as I said before, just as with climate change, so with COVID-19, it can affect anyone, but it's the poor and the disadvantaged who tend to suffer most. And the biblical perspective, as we've been thinking about, and as Keith kindly said at the beginning, it's something I think about because I study earthquakes and volcanoes professionally. The biblical perspective is that disasters occur mainly because humankind has failed to care for and to rule properly the world that God created, the world that God said was very good. So viruses are part of that very good world, as are earthquakes and volcanoes. And in their right place, those things are all good and helpful. And it's because we've acted selfishly, put our own needs first, that this world is out of kilter. It's fractured, if you like. It's not the way it was meant to be. Well, I want to finish with hope for the future, because if this world is fractured at the moment and not the way God meant it to be, he is going to restore it. He's going to bring it to its fullness in the way he meant it to be, in the fullness of time. And this is something the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to Romans. Paul had suffered immense sufferings. He'd been beaten by people, he'd been in earthquakes, he'd been through famine, he'd almost drowned, had been shipwrecked, all kinds of things. And yet, despite all that, he was able to say that I consider that our present sufferings, and we might include COVID-19 in that, are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us, said Paul. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And what he's getting at is that it's humans that have made this world be out of kilter, and it's longing for that time when it will be put right again. We know that the whole creation, Paul went on to write, has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And if you've been with somebody through childbirth, usually it is the case that it's a pretty painful experience. So, of course, I haven't experienced that, though I have watched my wife experience it. But I've also seen that as soon as that new life, that young baby is born safely, and God willing it is, then those pains are put behind immediately in the joy of that new birth. And that's the picture that Paul is using here. And to finish off right at the end of the Bible, there is this hope for the future. In Revelation, it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, where there'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. That God will come down to dwell with us and make this world the way he meant it to be. Well, I want to finish with a quote that I heard on the radio on Sunday. Francis Collins, a lovely Christian man, he's head of the biggest scientific institution in the world, the National Institute of Health in the USA. Just this month, he was awarded an FRS, elected to an Fellow of the Royal Society, and was awarded the Templeton Prize, which is equivalent to a Nobel Prize in its value. And he was talking about this, and this is what he said just at the end of his interview. The only thing that spreads faster than a virus is hope. And I thought, what a great message that is, and what a great opportunity people of faith have to share that hope in a time which many find fearful and bewildering. So I think I'll stop there and leave it open to maybe for reflections from the panel and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. It's very helpful. I'm going to call on Denis Alexander and Roger Abbott to give their personal responses to what Bob has said before we throw the whole thing open for wider discussion. And remember the Q&A tab on your Zooms. And while we're getting the technology sorted out, bringing those two online as the panel, let me introduce them to you. Both of them closely associated with the Faraday Institute. Reverend Dr. Roger Abbott is a senior research associate, particularly involved in studying natural disasters from a pastoral perspective. He has a PhD in practical theology of disaster response, and he's studied many of the disasters across the world, from the Philippines to New Orleans to Haiti, to name but a few. So Roger will give us, if you like, a pastoral response. And Dr. Denis Alexander is the other founding director of the Faraday Institute. He was previously chair of the molecular immunology program at the Abraham Research Institute here in Cambridge, and he will be therefore speaking to us this afternoon, giving his reflections as a molecular and biological scientist. I'm going to call on Roger first to respond to what Bob has said from a pastoral perspective. Roger, a short reflection, maybe 3 minutes, and then we'll pass over to Denis, and then we'll come back to whatever questions anybody out there might want to ask. Roger.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Bob, for that very instructive and illuminating presentation you've given to us. I had a number of things jotted down in readiness, most of which you yourself have covered already. But I thought it was worth reflecting from my perspective as a researcher in these disasters, and also as a responder to disasters. I first came into the disaster world, which formed the base of my PhD, back in 1989. I've also responded to terrorist activities, events, the Grenfell Tower fire, and then recently I was on local television giving a series of interviews because they wanted to know about flooding. What was my take as a theologian on flooding? And I remember thinking at that time, well, and saying that just about the only thing that happens to us in this country, and I'm not minimizing that, is things like floods and sports events or transport. Not, of course, having any inkling that around the corner we were to be hit by this pandemic of COVID-19 virus. And this is, of course, a disaster of huge proportions for all sorts of reasons. Bob has enunciated on most of those. And when I came back from particularly the work I did in Haiti after the terrible earthquake there, I shared with Bob, and if Bob remembers this, I said, I'm very fearful, Bob, because what I'm learning from my research work is that we are just not prepared pastorally or psychologically for a disaster of catastrophic proportions, such as I'd seen in low-income countries. And what had astonished me with, of course, when I went into Haiti, there was already an epidemic there of cholera on top of their earthquake trauma. And what surprised me was how resilient those people were with all their disadvantages, infrastructurally, politically, economically, how resilient they were with their faith in responding to these terrible things that had happened to them. And I said, I fear for the West. And I really wonder whether I'm beginning to see, maybe I had a point, and how ill prepared we are pastorally and psychologically, because now, of course, the big thing is this huge scare that as the pandemic draws on and even dilutes, there will be, I think the term is a tsunami of mental health problems. Well, it remains to be seen whether those will actually materialize, but my fear is they will. And are we as a church, are we as Christians and as churches and faith communities, are we prepared to address any of those issues from a biblical and psychological point of view? So Bob has really drawn attention, I think, to the devastation of COVID. And I think we have a very big challenge facing us as Christians in the months and in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That's very helpful. I'm sure that the people might want to pose questions in the Q&A to Roger just as much as they might want to Bob or to Denis in a moment. And I hand over to you, Denis, maybe to give a biological scientist perspective on this.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, so thanks especially, of course, to Bob for a great overview, which I really enjoyed, and lots of really good material in there. Just a couple of points I was going to mention briefly. One was just on the science side. Bob was mentioning how viruses are part of our God's good creation, which might possibly shock some people. And I guess it's worth mentioning that somebody's calculated that there are something like 10 to the 31, that's 10, with 31 zeros in it, viral particles in the world. And I guess calculating that sort of thing is quite tricky. But anyway, it's a very large number. One of the reasons it's such a large number is because many of the viruses attack bacteria, and there are a lot of bacteria in the world. And as we were hearing also, the bacteriophage and so forth. I was also thinking of the fact that our own genomes are comprise, that's our DNA sequence, consists of 88% retroviral DNA that came into our genomes millions of years ago and is still there, which, by the way, is on a, just in parenthesis, is really useful for mapping our evolutionary history, but also more significantly has contributed a number of quite good genes to our own bodies. So there are some genes in our bodies that we came from viruses very clearly, and that we really need. And just to give you one example of that, one of them is syncytin. Syncytin is a gene that encodes a protein called syncytin, which is required for normal placental development. And there are certain reproductive illnesses that come from defects in syncytin and so forth. So it's just worth reflecting on the fact of that life is a package deal, and along with bacteria and viruses, we get our own genomes and all the rest of it. We're all linked up together. We're all part of this same history of life. We're all part of this same book of life. And I just think it's worth reflecting on that in this context. Second thing I was just going to mention is more a personal story, just to back up some of the things that Bob was saying pastorally there at the end. So I worked in the American University Hospital during a great slice of the civil war there in Beirut, Lebanon, back in the early 1980s. And I always remember thinking that what happens in a civil war, which is a horrible, horrible kind of pandemic to have, is that it highlights the good and the evil in people in a very remarkable way. And part of what happens in a civil war is you see obviously great evils all around you. You see a lot of killing, you see a lot of people just being shot dead on the spot and so forth and so on. Saw plenty of that. But you also see some of the goodness in humanity coming out, and it highlights some of the cooperation, some of the help that you see also. I always remember people volunteering in the American University Hospital and around from all the religious communities, by the way, Christian, Muslim, Druze, whatever it might be, and they were volunteering to go and be working in ambulances. And therefore, as we would be running away from bomb spots, they would be running towards them in their ambulances to care for the wounded and the dying. And I just always found that very, very remarkable, really. So I do think that, as Bob was saying, a pandemic can bring out the good and the ill in people to a very dramatic degree, but also certainly make people think in ways that they haven't probably been thinking before. And I think it's very remarkable that many, many people have been coming on to online church services and other forms of other talks about theology and the virus and so forth that would never normally have done this before. And I think that's something really interesting that's going on right now. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Denis. I remind people the Q&A line is open for anybody to ask any questions. And you can pose those to Bob or to Roger or to Denis. And I'm going to keep my eye on the screen. And maybe, I don't know whether to ask Bob or to ask Roger this one. Maybe we'll start with Bob and move to Roger. So one of the questions here is, another challenge facing us is the extreme economic consequences of the lockdown, unemployment, bankruptcy, etc., which will cause great distress. How prepared are we for that? Maybe I can turn to Roger first on that one.
Thank you. Yeah, the economic cost, of course, is a huge cost, not just in financial figures. I mean, the billions of pounds, dollars being touted around. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. You can't get your head around it. And of course, that has huge implications on people's welfare, their jobs, their employment, their capacity to put food on the table. The social implications of this are enormous. As to whether we are prepared for this, I don't know. My gut feeling is that in this country, we have ill prepared for it as far as the politics and the economics are concerned. And I suspect, without becoming political, that this is something that, you know, people will be held to account for. in the outfall and the wash, as it were, of the pandemic. And certainly in my studies, I've become aware of some grave shortcomings in terms of the preparations that have gone on or have not gone on. And I think Brexit has been a huge distraction. I mean, we weren't to know that this pandemic was coming then, of course. So Brexit was a huge thing in itself. And that had economic implications and still stands to. And then to have the pandemic on top of that, it is a huge challenge for our politicians. And that is why I think we need to have people there in whom we can have great confidence. We need the economists, we need the politicians, but we need them with integrity, and we need to have confidence in their messages, their warnings, and their encouragements. So I don't think we have been particularly well prepared, and I think globally, because it is a pandemic, and you know, we haven't had time to prepare, as it were, because we've been preoccupied with so many other things. But yes, the economic is a huge factor.
Thank you, Roger. Do you want to quickly respond to that also, Bob? And
yeah,
I've got a number of other questions here as well.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. One of the things this has shown up so clearly in Britain, and I think in the USA the same, is that we live in a very unequal society. The division between low income and high income has increased in recent years, not decreased. And this has shown up how dependent we are on largely the lower paid people that we kind of don't even see when they're stacking the shelves in the supermarket. We just complain there's not enough toilet rolls. And the low income people in care homes and nursing and collecting rubbish, all those things. And I think that economic side of it has shown up very clearly, and at least people recognize that. In Britain, we go outside at 8 o'clock on Thursday and clap for them. Well, I hope that clapping for them and banging saucepans actually translates into better living wages for them after this is over. I could talk more about the global situation, but I think that's enough for now.
Thank you. I've got another question for Bob, and then I've got one particularly for Denis. So Bob, somebody asked that they were struck by the way you used the words good and evil and wicked about viruses. How do you mean that? Is that figurative, or do you see diseases as part of the moral package?
Yes, I didn't mean the virus was wicked. I meant it's a wicked problem to have. It's a very difficult problem to solve. They're morally neutral. It's what we do with the environment we live in. As Denis said, you know, they're part of the package of what makes this world work. As are volcanoes, as are earthquakes, as are floods. We need them to make it a fertile, habitable world. And what goes wrong is when humans interact badly with it. And most of that bad interaction, most of it at least, is due to human selfishness and human greed, which actually the Bible, the Christian perspective, says that's sin. That's putting myself ahead of others. That's the sense in which I meant it was a wicked problem. Not that the virus itself is evil or wicked, because it's part of this world, but the way we interact with it that is.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So I'll start with Denis on this one, and I'm going to pass over to Bob. Bob in his talk said that disasters are partly due to human failure to care properly for the world that's been created. But viruses have been around for a very long time, and they would have had spread and had impact on all sorts of animal populations, if not human ones, causing suffering. How does that fit in with your idea that viruses are all part of the package? And are they really part, is this to do with human failure?
So, yes, well, I think as Bob was just saying, I don't think there's anything evil per se in a virus or a bacteria or anything else for that matter. And clearly it's we who have the responsibility to care for the world and to subdue it, as Bob was bringing out so helpfully. So, and therefore that raises the question, well, how do we cope then? How do we try and prevent future coronaviruses, of which there are many, many, coming along and having another pandemic? And there are some quite simple things to do, actually. And one of them, obviously, is to take greater care about the use of wild animals to track. There are labs who are tracking all the particular viruses that you find in bats. There's a lab right there in Wuhan. And by the way, the person who runs that lab in Wuhan was, I read an interview with her just the other day. She was saying how worried she was when the whole pandemic first started out there in Wuhan in China, and she was worried that maybe there had been an escape of one of the bat viruses that they were working on, the coronaviruses, and they work on a lot of them, by the way, in that particular laboratory. And so she quickly sequenced the coronavirus, the COVID-19 that was infecting the whole population of Wuhan at that time, and was just incredibly relieved to find out that the sequence was different from any of the sequences of the coronaviruses they were working on in the lab at that time. So, so there are ways of checking this out, and I think part of subduing coronaviruses is just being really, really careful about, I'm afraid, we have to be a bit blunt here, and there's legislation coming through on the use of some of these animals in apparently in tradition for transmission, and eating them is another avenue for transmission, working on them too closely in meat markets and so forth. So really it comes down to being very careful about how we handle animals and how we care for them and what we do with them. And that's part of this story I think we need to take note of.
Thank you. Thank you. Bob, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Denis said it very clearly. That's my view exactly.
Okay, thank you. The business about life, the viruses being part of life that's a package. Bob, you said that they're part of God's good creation, I think. Do you want to maybe amplify on that a little bit?
Well, they do good things, as Denis said. We've got a huge percentage of our DNA as retroviral inserts, viruses. They often mutate very quickly, bring new genetic material in. I'm afraid geneticists have had this term junk DNA for a long time, which Denis can say something about. Calling it junk DNA says more about our ignorance than its function, and I think people are stopping using that phrase. That's where a lot of these things reside, and they just are part of our makeup. So, and they do good things for animal. Some mammals, it stops them getting infection, and Denis talked about this particular placental mechanism, which requires a virus to make it work in mammals, in humans. So they do good things. It might just be our ignorance that we don't know all those good things they do. What's bad is when you have a good thing in the wrong place, isn't it? And that's true of all sorts of things that are normally good. You can use nuclear energy to make electricity, or can use to make a bomb. It's good in one context, and well, I think so. Some people might not. It's good for making electricity, it's bad for making bombs. And that is the nature of the world. It's the moral status of humans is that we have to choose between these things. We have to use them wisely, and that's part of the world we're in. So I have a very similar view to Denis on this, I suspect.
Yes, do you want to add to that?
Well, only just to say briefly that, as I was mentioning, I think in terms of the biology, we can make a huge table mentally in our minds. On one side, we can put all the stuff in biology that is good for us, without which we wouldn't be alive, basically. And on the other side, we can put a whole great long list of every single thing that we've just mentioned. On the plus side, we can also think about how it can go wrong. Of course, we need cells to live, but also cells can go wrong and keep multiplying, and that's what we call cancer, and so forth and so on. And so every time we eat food, we create free oxygen radicals that actually increase the rate of mutations. So do we stop eating food because of that? No, we don't. And so every single thing that we do is going to have plus or minus, if you like, implications for our own well-being and our own existence as biological beings on this planet. So that maybe helps us a little bit to think about this.
I'll come with one last question. I'll start with Roger on this one and then give Bob the final word on this. And Roger, you referred to a tsunami of mental health issues that could be coming. We haven't prepared well enough for that in advance. What should we be doing now in preparation for that?
Yeah, well, it depends who you are, first of all. Clearly, this is going to be a field that the professional psychologists are doubtless already working on, and there is a huge amount of experience internationally to address the potential problems that come from this, which mainly are based around fear. Fear has a huge part to play in our mental health. Fear and anxiety and all its attachments. From a Christian point of view and from a Christian community point of view, again, I think it depends who we are and where we're at. Where are we in the realm of fear? How has the pandemic how is it affecting us? Have we been able to address the fears around potentially mental health issues? I think as communities, we have a responsibility towards those who have pre-existing mental health issues, very much so in terms of our care and our support. And that's very difficult. I mean, my wife and I finding this already because we have power of attorney for someone who has mental health issues, and they're under lockdown. They're not only in their lockdown, they're you know, they are not allowed to go out. They're quarantined basically, and they're finding it very, very difficult. And we just have to be there for them, to keep up conversation with them, to keep contact with them on a daily basis, because the moods swing and it's very, very unpredictable. So as Christian communities, we have to be aware of people in lockdown or under quarantine or being shielded who have mental health, pre-existing mental health issues, and just be there to be a help and an encouragement and a support for them. As much as one can, a presence. This is something that is so helpful in terms of how we can bring help in times of stress and trauma, is be a presence. It's not so much about what we say, it's more about just being there and what we do and showing our love and support in those ways. I think that's the major contribution which the Christian community has to offer.
Thank you, thank you. And I'll give the last word to Bob in a minute just to close this out. Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you. The main thing that struck me in this whole affair of the last 3 months has been how important community is. I'm sort of singing from the same hymn sheet as Roger here, because we've been deprived of it, except thankfully through this sort of medium, through the technology that we are able to keep in touch. And I think it's a lesson that we needed to learn, because the 21st century and the late 20th century, we've, at least in high-income countries like Britain, Europe, North America, we've become so individualistic. And I'm afraid even our churches have become so individualistic. It's how I feel today about this, that this is a reminder that we live in community with others. And I think this has brought it out very starkly. And I hope it's a lesson we remember when we come back to the new normal, that we don't just forget all this and put it behind us. I hope we remember that we rely on the poor, the low, the disadvantaged for our lifestyles, and that we share resources more equitably with them. I hope we take more care of our community relationships, our relationships with others. If we've learned nothing else, that's a very significant thing to have picked up on. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Bob and to Denis and to Roger for their contributions as well. Thank you to each of us for making us think, and I think we will carry on. This is not going to go away very quickly, and the effects of us and the way we respond are going to be with us over the months and years to come. If we were in Cambridge in the garden room, as we usually are, we would give all three of you a good round of applause. So you can take that as an electronic round of applause. Thank you very much for stimulating our thought this afternoon.